Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading Intelligent Equanimity. September 2001. Every evening before we meditate, we chant the four sublime attitudes. Goodwill, may all living beings be happy. Compassion, may they all be free from stress and pain. Appreciation, may they not lose the happiness they've found. And then there's equanimity. Instead of saying, all living beings can just go to hell, I don't care, the chant says, all living beings are the owners of their actions, heirs to their actions. Exactly how is that thought related to equanimity? Notice that it comes last in the list. In other words, you cultivate goodwill, compassion, and appreciation. But then there comes a point where you realize that you can have goodwill for people, but they're not happy. You can have compassion for them and they still don't get released from their sewering. You can have appreciation for their happiness, but they abuse it. They abuse their power, they abuse their wealth. You begin to realize that there's only so much you can do, not only for other people, but also for yourself. That's where the reaction on karma comes in. You realize that certain things are caused by past karma, and there's no way you can change them. Other people's karma places limitations on them, your own karma places limitations on you. You have to live realistically within those limitations. You can push them a bit, you can push the envelope to see how much you can work for your own happiness and for that of others, but there comes a point where the envelope pushes back. You realize that you can only do so much at any given time. You can do only so much with the energy, the talents you have. So the appropriate response is to put aside the areas where you can't help or can't make a difference, so that you can focus on the areas where you can. That's what the chant on karma is all about. To give you a sense of priorities, to remind yourself of what's important. You've got a limited amount of energy, a limited amount of time in this life. You help where you can, but if you can't help, there's no point in getting upset, no point in sewering over it. There's no point in expending your energies in areas where you just can't make a difference, for you only have so much. Equanimity means making peace with the principle of karma, so that you can work within it and use your energy wisely. That's part of what it means to say, whatever you do for good or for evil, to that will you fall heir. You have to accept the principle of karma if you're going to be skillful in using what you've got. The teaching on equanimity is not counseling cold indifference. It's simply reminding you of where your priorities are, where your limitations are, and that you've got to work within those limitations. In other words, if an issue comes from your past karma, you realize you can't change that. What you can change, what you can shape is what you're doing right now. So focus there. There's a passage where the Buddha talks about the skillful and unskillful ways of teaching karma, and of thinking about karma. An unskillful way is to say that everybody who does evil is going to go to hell, everybody who does something bad is going to sewer. You look back and you realize that you, like everyone else, have done some bad things in your life. The times when you acted on less than noble or less than your best intentions. If you simply brood over your big mistakes, you put yourself into a spiral that goes down, down, down. It doesn't help you at all. What you should do is to remind yourself that even though there's past karma, there's also new karma, a fresh slate. You can choose freely right now to act as skillfully as possible. Whatever you've done in the past that was unskillful, just put it aside. Make up your mind that you're not going to make that same mistake again. And then move on. It's not that you deny your mistakes. You freely admit them. It's not that you're blasé about them. You realize that a mistake's a mistake and you don't want to repeat it. But if you simply brood on the mistakes you made in the past, you don't leave yourself the energy needed to act skillfully in the present moment. It's a matter of priorities. Where are you going to focus your energies to get the best results? The reaction connecting the principle of karma with equanimity is meant to clear the decks so that you can focus right there on your present actions. That's where the true issue is. That's what underlies the basic structure of reality. When you can focus here, you don't get all caught up in all the what-ifs about the past. What if I had done this? What if I hadn't done that? All those what-ifs about the past are a massive waste of time. The important what-if is, what if I act skillfully now? Try that out. Buddhism doesn't teach heartlessness. It starts out with goodwill. Look at the path. It's a way of working for your own well-being and the well-being of those around you, a way of putting an end to sewering. That's goodwill put into action in spades. The teaching on equanimity is meant to make sure that your goodwill doesn't run over the road, doesn't burn out, doesn't waste time getting lost in unskillful byways. In other words, the Buddha doesn't tell you to be indifferent about your choices in the present moment, or to say, "Who cares what I do in the present moment?" You can't think that way. You have to let goodwill, compassion, and appreciation dominate your choice of how you're going to act right now and right now and right now, as the present keeps moving through time. You can't be indifferent to that. There has to be a strong sense of desire, purpose, and resolve about doing the most skillful thing you can, each moment you're aware of your choices. You have to make yourself more and more aware of exactly what choices you're making. That requires effort and energy. The development of equanimity husbands your resources so that you can focus them on the spot where they're most useful, where they really will make a difference. You develop equanimity about the path only when you've attained a goal. Even the equanimity you feel when you've attained a goal. There's a transcending of that as well, in what the texts call non-fashioning. In other words, you realize that equanimity is a choice you make. These are the things you're going to put aside, these are the things you're going to focus on. The things you put aside, you really do have to let yourself not get worked up about them. When the path is nearly completed, that's the point when it, too, comes into the realm of equanimity. You can let go of it. Don't fashion anything at all, not even the choices of equanimity. That's when the mind gains release. So you develop universal equanimity in accepting the principle of karma, but in applying it to your past and present choices, you need a selective equanimity up until the endpoint of the path. That way, instead of being a blanket indifference to everything which would be like being a dead person, equanimity becomes an important tool in keeping you alive and active, making sure all the energy and activity you've got to devote to the present moment is used in the best possible way. Otherwise you drag yourself down by taking on too many responsibilities, too many cares. When that happens, nothing much gets accomplished at all. Only when you focus your energies properly can they really pay off. As you develop your meditation, try to bring the mind to concentration so that it can maintain this state of equanimity from which you continue your work. In other words, you have equanimity for everything else at that point, aside from the development of insight. Then the equanimity serves to protect you as well. Ajahn Fuang once said, "If you don't have the equanimity of jhana, goodwill will cause you sewering, because you see how limited your ability to help other people is. You keep running up against the limitations created by your own past karma and exactly how much you can accomplish for them at any one time. You also run up against the limitations of their past and present karma. If you develop the proper equanimity to those limitations, you don't have to sewer because of them. You simply recognize them and work around them, on the areas that are open to you. Equanimity is an important way of nourishing you on the path, giving you strength, making sure that your basic goodwill for yourself and other people gets properly directed and not squandered. Don't think of equanimity as a heartless or cold state of mind. It's simply a very realistic way of looking at things. Notice that in the 4 sublime attitudes, the other 3 are, may all living beings be this way, may all living beings be that way. But when you get to the 4th one, the thought is, all living beings are the owners of their actions. There's no may in there, it's just a statement of fact. You recognize reality, you recognize the limitations in this causal realm in which we operate, and you make up your mind to work within those limitations in as creative and active way as is possible. Someone once wrote a book on Buddhism called The Intelligent Heart. This is precisely what these 4 attitudes try to develop. An intelligent heart, an intelligence in the way your heart, your will, and your motivation function in your life so as to get the most out of them. And equanimity is what makes the intelligence possible. Intelligent Design. September 30, 2005. One of the major ironies of how Buddhism has come to the West is how the teaching on dependent co-arising has been turned into a teaching on interdependence or interconnectedness. With the original teaching, the emphasis was on how things work together to cause suffering, whereas the new teaching is something to celebrate. It's good that everything works together, everything ties together. We're all interdependent, we're all interconnected, and it's a lovely, comforting thing. But when you look carefully at the way things are actually interconnected, it's hard to see much to celebrate. The tea is always a little loose, a little awkward, and this causes a lot of pain and suffering. Extra water vapor coming over the Atlantic has now killed people in New Orleans and driven up oil prices all over the United States. It's a weird string of connections. Or you don't have to look that far ahead. Just look at your own body, at how things are connected in the body. See how the human body is constructed. The back. As you grow older, you begin to realize how poorly designed the human back is. If there is a designer, it's not a very intelligent design, or if there is an intelligence behind it, it's a malicious intelligence. It's designed for pain, it's designed to fall apart. Or look at how human beings are born. You start with sex, which requires a lot of lust, but then lust, whoever designed lust, if there was a designer, was pretty malicious, because lust isn't something you can control. You start lusting after the wrong people, which is what most people seem to do most of the time. And lust doesn't only create babies. It also leads to deception, to murder, to disease, to all kinds of problems, and yet it's an essential part of the mix to keep the human race going. And then there's pregnancy. All the pains a woman goes through in bearing a child. In Thailand, before each ordination, they traditionally have an afternoon-long chant. A layperson is hired to chant to remind the young monk candidate of all the suffering his mother went through in raising him. If the chant lasts for about 4 hours, 3 of those hours are focused on the 9 months of pregnancy, the months of morning sickness, the months of something kicking in her stomach. And then there's birth. They say that the most extreme pain that a human being can endure is the pain of giving birth. And it's no fun for the child, either. If there is a design behind all this, if there is an intelligent design, it's a malicious intelligence. So this is the world that we're born into. This is how we're born. And it required a Buddha to approach the world with some compassionate intelligence, seeing all this interconnectedness and saying there is a way we can use these interconnected things, these dependent things, to end a way out of the suffering. That's what he gave his life to. Both the ending and the teaching. And it's a very fragile teaching. If you look at Buddhist history, you see that wherever the Dhamma goes, people end all kinds of ways of trying to divert the teaching to other purposes, forgetting that its original purpose was the most compassionate, showing the way out of suffering. Our imagination is so tied up with the normal way of using connectedness or interdependence that it really has trouble negotiating that compassionate use. This is why the path is so hard. It goes against the grain. If anything calls into question the idea of an intelligent designer or a compassionate designer, it's the fact that the quest for the end to suffering, the quest for a true and lasting happiness, goes so much against the grain of the human mind. Keep that in mind as you practice. It's to be expected that the practice is going to go against the grain. And because the path requires working with tools that normally tie into another purpose, the survival of the body, it's very easy for us to get off track. You have to keep in mind the fact that deep down inside your deepest desire is a desire for happiness, a happiness that's not going to change on you, a happiness that's not going to leave you. In the lurch, a happiness that doesn't have to involve other soaring. That was the desire the Buddha respected within himself, and he respected it within other people as well. That's why he searched for this path. When he found it, that's why he taught it to speak to that species desire. And yet there's so much in the world that tells us that it's unrealistic, it's too much trouble. All those voices are ready to pounce on any problems that come up in the practice. But keep that little burning inside. That if there's any sense to this life at all, it lies in a true happiness. Always try to protect that. Do what you can to maintain it, use your intelligence to sidestep any discouragements that might put it out. After all, this path is made out of conditioned things, so there are times when it seems like everything comes crashing down, and you have to put it together all over again. But it can always be put together again. Whether it's going to snew out that little aim is really up to you. The trick to surviving the bad periods in the path is to keep that long vision in mind, and to remember the nature of this path. It's a constructed path, a fabricated path. It leads to something unfabricated, but the path itself is a fabrication, which means that it's dependent on conditions. Sometimes the conditions aren't all they could be, but we do have this intelligence within us that can learn how to make the best of difficult things, makeshift things, to hammer things together in a new way. So do what you can to strengthen your intelligence on the path. This is a strength compass to these things. First, there's the conviction that there's got to be a way out of soaring. Second, there's persistence, sticking with that conviction, acting on it all the time. Third, there's mindfulness. You remember to keep that conviction in mind all the time and to apply it to all of your actions. Fourth and FTH are concentration and discernment. The discernment there is to help ND ways over the obstacles that we all inevitably ND on the path, and the concentration is to give your mind the food it needs to keep its energy up. The texts talk about persistence as a requisite for concentration, but the relationship goes the other way as well. Do your best just to stick with one object. When everything else seems to be crazy in life, just say, okay, I'm going to stay right here. If I don't know anything else for sure, what I do know for sure is that the breath is now coming in, the breath is now going out. Let's just hang out here for the time being. In that way you can weather whatever crisis comes up, and it gives you the strength to deal with things. To recover. I was reading recently about studies they've done of major disasters and catastrophes, huge hurricanes, earthquakes, They've noticed how people immediately after a catastrophe feel a bizarre sense of euphoria. They develop a sense of common purpose as they drop their normal concerns and band together to rebuild, to recover. Then, after a while, once things get back to normal again, everybody goes back to their old ways. As one researcher pointed out, right after a catastrophe there's a suspension of time, people's normal narratives stop functioning, and there's a sense of liberation from those narratives, as you've now got an obvious immediate common purpose. In fact, one of the researchers said it sounded a lot like Buddhist meditation to him. The idea of dropping the narrative of the past and the future and just staying with the present moment, finding a purpose in the present moment. That gave a buoyancy to the rebuilding efforts. Well, try to use that same attitude when your meditation comes crashing down. You've got some rebuilding work to do. It gives you a purpose and it's something you can focus on totally in the present moment. The best way of doing that is to drop the whole narrative that's driving you crazy. The fact that things seem to be going well, and now all of a sudden they've crashed. Whether it's a sudden crash or a gradual one doesn't really matter. What matters is that you realize, okay, just forget about the narrative and focus on the needs of the present moment. That's all you're responsible for. That's all you have to worry about. You'll ND that will give you the buoyancy, the energy you need in order to start the rebuilding work. So, again, what you're using here is the process of dependent co-arising, the interconnectedness of conditioned phenomena, but you're pointing it in a new direction. In one of the suttas the Buddha describes what one modern teacher has called transcendent dependent co-arising. It's the typical pattern, starting with ignorance and going through craving and ending up in sewering. And the normal reaction to sewering, as the Buddha once said, is a combination of bewilderment and search. We're bewildered about why this particular type of sewering is happening and we search, hoping that somebody else will know a way out. What usually happens is that the bewilderment simply adds more ignorance. The search turns into more craving, and that leads to more sewering. But there are times when the search turns into a solid conviction. There must be a way out. And you're going to do whatever is needed to end that way out. You've reacted on life and seen that the design, if there is a design, is not compassionate at all. All you have to see is someone go through the process of aging, illness, and death, and you realize if there is a design how harsh it is. But more likely this is just the way things happen to be, without any overarching point or purpose. As you realize that, you've got to react on the fact that there must be a way out. And you've got the Buddha and his noble disciples to say, yes, there is. We're fortunate that we have their testimony. Their testimony is like a challenge. Are you up for the challenge? If you're not, you're going to have to sewer like everybody else. If you are up for the challenge, though, you're still going to sewer for a while, but it will be in a different way. It's a sewering that leads to the end of sewering. So make the most of this opportunity because it's the only intelligent way to end happiness, and it doesn't come along all that often. The saints don't grieve. January 28, 2005. One of the most occult but important principles in the practice is what the Buddha called learning to see renunciation as freedom. For most of us, renunciation seems to be a restriction, as when you're getting the mind to focus on the breath. Before you make up your mind to do that, the mind doesn't seem to be restricted, doesn't seem to have any violent wishes or disorderliness or unruliness. But then all of a sudden, as soon as you tell it to stay with the breath, it ends all sorts of other places where it wants to go. It complains that it's being constricted, that it's being tied down. You have to learn not to listen to those complaints because, as the Buddha explains, when the mind really does settle down with one object, it's freed from a lot of restrictions and burdens. He describes progress through stages of concentration as stage-by-stage release. Simply getting the mind to stay consistently with the breath, you're released from unskillful mental states, released from sensual desires. That's a state of freedom, but there's a part of the mind that doesn't see it that way. And that part of the mind gets a lot of encouragement from the world outside, partly because it's in other people's interest to have us chained to our sensual desires. Once we're chained to our sensual desires, they have a hook to sell us things, to make us buy, and our desires play along with that. We mistrust the impulse toward celibacy, toward renunciation. I was talking a while back to a Zen practitioner, admittedly someone who wasn't all that advanced about conflict resolution in the community, and I pointed out that having the Vinaya as our standard was very liberating. To him that was an unusual idea, that rules could be liberating. Part of his quest, he said, was to learn how to see beyond rules, so that you weren't con-ed by them. So how could rules be liberating? I pointed out, for one thing, we don't have to sit around discussing what the standards of behavior in the community are going to be week after week after week. It's all settled. The standards are livable, they're humane. So having the standards established frees us to have a lot more time to practice. And that's just a very basic example. There are other ways in which rules are liberating as well. Popular culture likes to hear about monks and nuns who are having trouble with their vows, who end up either disrobing or acting out their desires in weird and convoluted ways. This shows that they're being con-ed and restricted by their rules, that they really miss the things that they gave up. That's what popular culture likes to hear, that it's offering us all the really good things in life, and that the alternatives are bogus. But when you really get a taste of what it's like to get the mind to settle down without having to hanker after other things, you see how liberating it is. When you see the rewards, you're more and more willing to let go of the things that you're normally attached to in favor of the freedom of not being attached. This impulse to mistrust the principle of renunciation isn't just an American or a Western issue. It goes way back in Buddhist history. For example, there's the Mahayana ideal that the arhants are stuck in a limited nirvana. The Mahayanists feel that bodhisattvas have more freedom because they have a foot in both worlds, they say. Well, nirvana is the opposite of being stuck. For one thing, it's not a place. When there's no place, there's no being stuck anywhere. Second, the person who attains nirvana is totally undead, with no restrictions whatsoever. From the outside it looks uninviting, but from the actual experience of the practice of learning to let go and be less and less denuded by this, that or the other attachment, it brings a huge sense of freedom. So, as we stick with our ears to stay with the breath, to stay with one thing, remember, we're sticking, but we're not stuck. We're not being con-ed. We're learning to give up restrictions, learning to get out of the chains that have become so familiar that we've learned to mistrust the idea that anybody could be happy outside of those chains. But the freedom beyond those chains is just what the Buddha's talking about. All his teachings aim in that direction. He said that his teachings all have a single taste. Just as the ocean has the taste of salt anywhere you go in the ocean. The water tastes salty everywhere you look. In his teachings, there's the taste of freedom, the taste of release. Even when he teaches restraint of the senses, again, it's for the purpose of liberating the mind from all the unskillful states that would arise if you weren't careful. He says that if you're not careful about how you look at things, how you listen to things, how you smell things, taste things, touch things, then the mind is assailed. It's injured by sense objects. To many people that amount of restraint sounds conning, but when you take the mind to a state of concentration where it's not injured in that way, you realize the sense of freedom, the sense of relief that results. So a lot of the practice comes down to a willingness to take the Buddha at his word, in spite of all of our fear of what it might be like to renounce things, to give things up, to show restraint. Our preconception is that it's very conning, and, as the song goes, the saints are so miserable they're crying and grieving. I'd rather laugh with the sinners than grieve with the saints. Well, the sinners don't laugh all that long, and the saints don't grieve. They're totally free. So allow space in your imagination for that possibility. That renunciation really is freedom, when you do it wisely, when you do it to learn and understand. Open up your imagination to the possibility that the Buddha was right, that all these practices and rules really do have the taste of freedom. A culture of restraint. April 11, 2005. The Buddha once compared sensory input to being like a dead cow with no skin. Everywhere the cow goes, insects bore into its flesh all the time. Our senses are constantly picking up information through the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body. And on top of that, the mind is its own sense. It picks up all kinds of ideas. The question is, how are you going to end any peace in the midst of all that? And the answer is, you have to be selective. The Buddha talks about restraint of the senses as an essential part of meditation. We often think of meditation as what starts as soon as you sit down and close your eyes, but actually it's going on all the time. The word for meditation, bhavana, means to develop. You should stop and look. What are you developing in your mind? When you follow certain trains of thought, you develop the habits that go along with them. You create ruts in the mind. When you give free rein to anger, you create an anger rut. When you develop mindfulness, you create a mindfulness rut. The next time you get anywhere near those patterns of thinking, the mind falls into the rut and goes along with it. We're doing this all the time. They've done study after study to show how selective our process of perception is. It happens on many levels. Some of it's conscious, some of it's not, but the upshot is that even before you sit down to close your eyes, you're already in a process of developing. The question is it developing the same thing the meditation is meant to develop? Are you developing calm or are you developing turmoil? Are you developing mental stability or are you developing restlessness? Look into this all the time. Everything you do, everything you say is a process of developing something. It's laying down ruts in the mind. So what kind of ruts do you want? We're trying to work on good ones as we sit here with our eyes closed, but if the rest of the day you're working on other kinds of ruts, it's a struggle. When you look at things, what are you looking for? Who's doing the looking? Is lust doing the looking? Is anger doing the looking? If these things are doing the looking, they create the ruts for more anger or more lust to keep on doing the looking. So throughout the course of the day, be careful of what you look at. This doesn't mean you can't look at good-looking things. It's just that when you see something good-looking, you have to remind yourself that there's another side to it as well. When you see something you really hate, remind yourself that there's another side to it as well. As Ajahn Lee used to say, be a person with two eyes. The same applies to your listening, what you smell, what you taste, what you touch, and especially what you think about. It's a common pattern that when you're sitting here meditating, you try to keep the mind under control, but then as soon as you get up, it's back to its old ways, just wandering around any place it wants to. And that way you're being inconsistent. If the mind is going to go someplace, you have to ask yourself, why are you going there? It's like that old slogan from World War II. Is this trip really necessary? Where are you planning to go? What are you planning to bring back? Be deliberate in your thinking. The Buddha's not saying not to think. He's just saying to have a sense of why you're thinking, what it's going to accomplish. The same holds true with the looking and the listening. Have a sense of why you're looking at something, what you're going to accomplish by looking at it. Why are you listening to certain things? All of this is part of the meditation, part of the developing, because you're creating the environment in your mind, and you want to make sure you're creating the right environment. Get your priorities in order. This way the meditation is less an attempt at a little island of calm in the midst of whirlpools. It's more a part of an ongoing process, realizing that the mind needs to be trained, and that the training is a full-time process. Even when you're out in the world, not just here at the monastery, you've got to look at where your mind is going, what it's picking up. In particular, notice what it's picking up, because there are all kinds of bizarre messages out there. As soon as you turn on the TV, pick up a newspaper, pick up a magazine, the question should always be, why do these people want me to believe this? So that you don't fall for the messages, for the unstated values. If this makes you a stranger in your surroundings, well, nah. Sometimes it's good to be a stranger, not to pick up everything. One of the advantages of going to Thailand was just that. No matter how much I was absorbed in the culture, in the language, there was still part of me that was an outsider, and that outside perspective was always important. Sometimes it helps you keep your sanity, because that outsider perspective can be your guide inside, your inner teacher. The Buddha talks about the traditions of the noble ones, or the customs of the noble ones. To practice in line with these traditions is to make you a person with one foot in two different cultures. The noble ones look at material things and say, remember all the suffering that goes into just providing food, clothing and shelter. So don't get all wrapped up in having lots of food, lots of clothing, a big house. Remember that those things have their drawbacks. The world out there is saying, buy, 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 but the noble ones are saying, no. Listening to the noble ones helps keep you bicultural. When the media push all kinds of materialistic values on you, there's a part of you that can say, no. You're not sucked into those things, and as a result the mind is more independent, has a lot more peace. It can keep its values straight even in crazy societies like ours. There's a phrase in the Dhammapada. The people who see shame in what's not shameful, or see no shame in what is shameful. A part of the world looks at the values of being moral, having principles, not ting tooth and claw to get lots of belongings, and see that as shameful, as something to be embarrassed about. That's why you've got to get out of that culture. This is why we need the culture of the noble ones. That voice of restraint inside is going to be your protection. Learn how to listen to it, to strengthen it, so that restraint in day-to-day life augments the restraint of your meditation. You're trying to focus on one thing, and you can stay there because you're used to exercising restraint in a healthy way. Knowing how much you can rein the mind in, When you have to give it a little extra leash, so it doesn't feel too con-ed, too cooped up, but at the same time knowing how much is too much. This is something you have to learn over time. So think about the environment you're creating in your mind, the environment that allows the mind to settle down, the values that allow it to settle down, so that when disturbing thoughts arise, you don't immediately go with them. You can look at them and say, "That's not a thought I want to follow." When you're used to saying no to things already, it's easier to say no to them when you're sitting here with your eyes closed focusing on the breath. And vice versa. When you've got your eyes open, you can remind yourself, "I've been able to overcome this thought before. I've been able to say no to it, and I haven't died." This way you can maintain your mental health, and the meditation really does become an ongoing process of developing the skillful qualities you want. Mindfulness, alertness, a sense of calm, a sense of wholeness and well-being in body and mind. As the Buddha said, the mind well-trained brings happiness. It needs to be well-trained because it's always doing things, so make sure that what it's doing is in line with where you want to go. Self-esteem. January 4, 2005. Life doesn't teach lessons. It's up to us to learn lessons, which means that we have to take the initiative. We can't wait for the things we need to know to be automatically presented to us as our birthright. Ajahn Fuang stressed this point when IRST went back to stay with him. He told me, "You have to think like a thief if you want to learn the Dhamma." In other words, don't expect everything to be handed to you on a platter. It's up to you to be observant. When you're listening to somebody talk, whether they're aiming at teaching you a lesson or not, what can you learn from what they have to say? When events happen in your life, when events happen to people around you, what can you learn? When you make the willingness to learn the basis for your self-esteem, that cuts through a lot of other issues as well. And it's one of the few forms of self-esteem that actually keeps you open to change. For many of us, self-esteem means thinking that basically we're good people, which means that we have to keep trying to look back on our past actions to see evidence of that. And then, of course, we run across things that don't support that idea, and so we block them out of our minds. We don't like to think about them. In many cases, those are precisely the things we need to learn from. So when you detect a tendency not to want to react on your past mistakes, try to look into the fear around that. Why are you afraid of looking at these things? Fear in and of itself is not a bad thing. The problem is when fear is conjoined with greed, anger, and delusion. The greed, anger, and delusion are what create the problem. Fear in and of itself can often be skillful. After all, a lot of the Buddha's teachings are based on the very rational fear of the suffering that comes with aging, illness and death. There's the word, atapa, which means the fear of the consequences of unskillful actions. That's something the Buddha encouraged. He says it's a treasure. There's also the word, samvega, which is sometimes translated as dismay or shock. It's related to an adjective, samviga, which means tarry-ed. You look at the way life goes aimlessly on and on and on, and the appropriate reaction is a sense of terror. One thing leads to another, and often nothing seems to lead anywhere worthwhile at all. As the Buddha emphasized, the only way out of this sense of terror or dismay is to develop strong confidence and conviction in the principle of karma, the principle of action. And that requires that you be willing to learn what's skillful, what's not. So when you see the mind refusing to look at mistakes you've made in the past, you have to ask yourself, what's being threatened by the idea of looking at those mistakes? Often you find that it's your sense of self-esteem, your sense of, "I'm basically a good person, I wouldn't want to hurt people." You don't want to admit the things you did to hurt yourself, to hurt others. You don't want to look at feelings and emotions that you feel guilty or ashamed of. But if you're really serious about putting an end to suffering, you need to develop the strength of mind to look into those things, for otherwise the consequences of not looking into them are even more fearsome. So it's not an issue of learning not to have fear, it's learning where fear should properly be focused. And where it should be focused is on the idea that if you don't learn from your past mistakes, you're never going to learn. At the very least, you're not learning anything right now, And in not learning anything right now, you're leaving yourself open to all kinds of mistakes in the future. So look at the sense of self-esteem that wants to say, I'm already good, that wants a nice pat on the head, and if nobody else gives one, gives itself a pat on the head. Look at the price of trying to keep that sense of self-esteem shored up, of trying to protect it when it's so obviously fragile. If you try to maintain that kind of self-esteem, you're setting yourself up for a fall, because you can't continue to stay in denial forever. Even while you're in denial, the sewering that comes from your actions just keeps coming back, coming back, coming back. We see this pattern in other people, and as the Buddha says, the wise person is someone who learns lessons from other people's actions as well. There's that famous sutta about the 4 types of horses. The quick, well-trained horse only has to see the shadow of the whip, and he does what he knows should be done. Next down, there's the horse has to feel the whip on his coat. Then there's the horse who has to feel the whip cutting into his hide, and nally the horse who has to feel the whip cutting into his bone. In other words, if we're wise, we learn to look at the dangers around us and not wait for them to hit us full force before we say, I've had enough of this dangerous samsara, I'm ready to get out. Or, I've had enough of this particular way of acting, I'll have to learn how to stop. They say in AA that someone really has to hit rock bottom before he's willing to learn anything from the program. That's the way human nature normally is. Even then, there are people who hit rock bottom and still don't learn. So it's more a question of your discernment in seeing when it's time to give up a sense of self-esteem that's based on a rickety foundation, one that constantly has to be shored up to the point where people sewer. Most people never learn. They sewer hardly just because they want to retain a little scrap of self-respect here or there. So take that lesson and apply it to yourself, looking back at your past mistakes. Don't be afraid to look there, for if you're afraid to look there, you're maintaining a delusion. And that delusion is going to hurt you further down the line. So it's either or. Which sense of well-being are you going to choose? The well-being built on the shaky ground of already being a good person, or the well-being of having the attitude that you're always willing to learn? The RST attitude is the one to drop. The second attitude is the one that offers hope, that's based on a much more solid foundation, for there's always the possibility to keep learning and learning and learning. When you're dealing with difficult things from the past, have the attitude that, at least I'm going to learn from this. That shifts the foundation onto something much more solid, so that you're not making your happiness depend on something you know is going to be washed away by the waves of time. It's a foundation based on a much more clear-eyed sense of fear, focused on what should appropriately be feared, the unwillingness to learn, for that's what keeps people blind. That's what keeps people sewering. This unwillingness to learn is something we all sewer from, and we all need to learn how to overcome it. Only when we can overcome it do we actually start learning lessons. Otherwise we go through life refusing to learn the lessons that are potentially there. So try to be the sort of person who picks up lessons quickly, because the more quickly you pick them up, the less you sewer. It's as simple as that. And the sewering that comes from being slow to pick up lessons or from being unwilling to pick up lessons, that's something really worth being afraid of. The Buddha encouraged his son, Rahula, to make the willingness to learn at all times the basis for his practice. And he explained to Rahula how to learn. You look at your actions and you look at the results. When the results turn out to be harmful, you're not ashamed to talk them over with someone else. Talk them over with someone who has experience on the path. Get that person's perspective and then resolve not to make that mistake again. When you do things properly, your intention is skillful, and no unhappy results come, then you can take joy in the practice. This is where that sense of self-esteem is properly placed. Take joy that you're continuing to grow in the practice. And just that shift in attitude makes all the difference in the world. The midness of the path. August 13, 2004. This path we're following. There's a way in which you could call it sensitivity training, getting more and more sensitive to the way the mind creates sewering for itself. As you deal with a layer of blatant sewering, you peel it away and end another, more subtle one. This is a lot of what the training in discernment is about. Working from the blatant layers to the more subtle ones by trying to stay on the path. The Buddha called it a middle way, and getting that sense of middleness or balance is a lot of our training in discernment. If you've ever looked at a balance, you see that the two sides don't stay balanced all the time. They swing back and forth before they can come to a point of equilibrium. And we have to learn to anticipate that in the practice. Sometimes you lean too far to the left and then too far to the right, back and forth like this before you come to any kind of balance. A lot of the wisdom and discernment that come in the path lie in learning how to negotiate all the back and forth. When you follow a particular tack in your practice and then end that it goes too far, you've got to turn around and go back the other way, and often you'll end you've gone too far the other way, too, so you have to turn around and come back and forth like this. The wisdom lies in learning how to deal with the back and forth, and not get frustrated with it, realizing that when you make mistakes you're learning lessons. When you learn from your mistakes, you'll ultimately be able to reach balance and learn how to regain it quickly whenever it gets knocked to either side. The other aspect of the middleness of the path is that it's appropriate for whatever comes up. In other words, it doesn't just call for middling eared all the time. Sometimes your ear has to be strong, sometimes it has to be very, very subtle. And again, mastering this point requires sensitivity. The Buddha once talked about two kinds of right-eared. Some kinds of suering, he said, require a really concerted ear to deal with them, others simply require that you watch. This is a lesson we can learn with the breath. Sometimes there are levels of discomfort in the breath you can actually deal with, patterns of tension in the body you can work through, by experimenting, by trying this, trying that, making the breath longer, shorter, deeper, more shallow, changing your conception of the breath. But sometimes you run up against a brick wall. Nothing you do seems to help. The more you meddle with the breath, the more muddled it gets. Either you're too heavy-handed or too picky about what kind of breathing is good enough for you. So you've got to back and just watch for a while to see whether the problem is in the breath or in the mind. And don't be too quick to come to conclusions. When you see an opening that seems to make sense, maybe this could be changed a little bit, maybe that could be changed a little bit, then you can get back to meddling with the breath again. Try things out. If they don't work, go back to just watching. The practice goes back and forth like this. A lot of the discernment in the path comes with learning where the extremes are, how far you can push things, and when you have to stop and just watch for a while, trying to do as little as possible. If the breath seems too entangled, the more you work with it, the worse it gets. Just tell yourself, I'm not going to breathe. If the body wants to breathe, then it can do it on its own, but I'm not going to participate. See what happens. Of course the body will have to breathe. Give it a chance to be unmeddled with for a while. Then you watch what an unmeddled breath is like, until you get a sense for it. Sometimes the issue centers on how far you can get the mind to settle down. Given the level of concentration, given the level of mindfulness you have, maybe you can only settle it down a little bit for the time being, and yet you want more. It's not good enough, especially if you've had better meditations in the past. The current meditation isn't measuring up, so you try to push it back to where it was. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, because the pushing may be part of the problem. Or if you've been away from the practice for a while, the level of sensitivity in the mind is not what it was, particularly your sensitivity to what you're doing. When this happens, get the mind to settle down at least a little bit, and then just stay there for a while. It may not be perfect, but it's good enough. Then watch. If you can see yourself causing any form of stress or suering, you can drop it. That will move you to another level of sensitivity, and so you stay at that level for a while, and then just watch again. So the middleness of the middle way actually means the appropriateness of what you're doing vis-a-vis the circumstances you've got. There are no hard and fast rules that you're not allowed to meddle with the breath at all. Or that you have to be meddling all the time, or that you always have to push for greater and greater and greater levels of concentration. Sometimes you have to learn to be satisfied with what you've got. You know the story about the foolish, inexperienced cow. She's got a nice meadow with nice water, but she looks over to the other mountain and says to herself, "Gee, the grass over there looks pretty good, too. I wonder what the water tastes like over there." But to get there, she has to go down into a ravine. So the foolish, inexperienced cow heads down into the ravine, but because she's foolish and inexperienced, she gets stuck in the ravine. She can't even get back to her original meadow, much less to the other side. What this means is that when you end a level of concentration, a level of comfort in the breath that seems okay, stick with it for a while. See if you can maintain it. Watch it. Don't push too hard to make it any better until you see clearly that there's a level of stress, a level of discomfort, a level of disturbance that really doesn't have to be there. That's when you can let that disturbance go, because the stillness allows you to see. One of the things it allows you to see is precisely what needs adjusting. So the two go together, the doing and the watching, and there has to be a balance between the two. It's like walking. The easy way to walk is RST with one foot and then with the other. That's a lot easier than trying to hop along just on your right foot or just on your left. This is what keeps the path on the middle. Ding the balance between the two, balance not so much in the sense of a little bit of eart and a little bit of watching, but knowing when which one is appropriate, because you've got to have both. Sometimes you need more of one than the other, like the balance that swings back and forth before it comes to a perfect balance. As Ajahn Chah once said, we're groping our way in the practice. We like to think that we have the whole thing mapped out ahead of us, but if we knew the map entirely, and if our map were entirely perfect, we'd already be at the end of the path. The map we have is just a sketch, and we have to feel our way. Your willingness to feel your way, to learn from your mistakes, is what develops your wisdom, develops your discernment. Sometimes it's a little chastening to see how little wisdom and discernment you have, but what are you going to do? You make use of what you've got. There's no way you can get more without using what you've got. It's like going down to the gym. You want to go to the gym to get exercise, but you feel embarrassed because your body is so weak, and everybody else is so tall and strong. But if you're embarrassed, you never get down there to work out. So you take the body you've got and you exercise that. Only then will it turn into the body you want. In the same way, if you only have a little bit of discernment and a little bit of concentration, make use of what you've got. Only when you make use of these things will they grow. Be content with what you've got, content not in the sense that you're going to stay here forever, but content with the fact that these are your raw materials, these are the tools you have. You want big muscles, but you've only got little muscles. You can't wait until your muscles are big and then exercise. You exercise the little muscles you've got. That's where big muscles come from. You've got to start where you are. And being very clear about what you've got is a lot of what you learn as you practice. There are times when the practice is intended to throw you up against situations where you come to the end of your rope, where you have to use your ingenuity to figure out what you should do next. As Ajahn Fuang said, if everything were handed to you on a platter, you'd never develop discernment at all. It's by testing it and admitting mistakes, learning from your mistakes, getting clearer and clearer about exactly you've got here. That's how the path opens up. The Buddha described nibbana as being immediately present, sanditiko right here in the here and now, but remember that time right after he gained awakening, where he reacted on whether he could teach or not. He was discouraged because nibbana was so subtle. He wondered how he could ever teach anybody, how anyone could learn what he had to teach. But he realized that people could be led to it, step by step. This is why our path is a gradual one, a step-by-step path, as we become more and more sensitive to what we're doing, more sensitive to the results. So that gradually we become more and more sensitive to what's actually right here. And it's in working with this issue, the middleness of the path, what's appropriate right now in terms of our concentration, in terms of staying with something, in terms of pushing a little bit more. That's how we get more and more sensitive to what's going on right here. In pursuing the middleness of the path we develop our discernment. And remember, a lot of discernment is seeing how foolish you've been, because that's the only way you're going to get wise. So the image of the path is of the continental shelf over the coast of India. A long gradual slope, followed by a sudden drop. We all like the idea of the sudden drop, the momentary insight that reveals everything in a ash, but you can't get to the drop without following the gradual slope of getting more and more subtle in your sensitivity. And a lot of the subtlety lies in seeing just where the middleness of the middle path lies. In keeping with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the profound significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this voluminous 1,000-page tome into an easily accessible audio format. Now, the responsibility to further this noble cause rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and content shares, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's uphold the age-old tradition of sharing knowledge and fostering mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We invite you to join us in this mission, and together, we can create a profound impact on the lives of many.